The night in the mountains had turned into a silence so heavy it pressed against the eardrums of every man crouched in the valley. The SEAL team had been moving for 16 hours, their boots grinding into gravel, their backs soaked in sweat beneath plates of armor and gear, their lungs burning with the thin air of elevation. Their mission had been simple in briefing but hellish in execution. Extract an informant who had been providing the location of insurgent weapons caches, a man who had risked his life for weeks to keep American soldiers alive. They had reached the compound, found the man bloody and terrified and gotten him out, but as always in this part of the world, the exfiltration was where everything turned into chaos. They were 2 kilometers from their designated extraction point when the first RPG screamed from the ridge, lighting up the darkness with a shower of fire. The team hit the ground, the informant pulled into the dirt between them, rifles snapping up toward the sound of the launch. Bullets tore the rocks around them, echoing in the bowl of the valley like thunder. The SEALs returned fire in tight, controlled bursts, years of training in every squeeze of their triggers, but there were too many shadows, too many muzzle flashes blinking along the high walls. Their radios had been buzzing with static for the last 10 minutes, air power promised but never arriving, and now the reality of it crashed against them with cold clarity. There would be no fast movers overhead, no strafing runs to break the ambush, no gunships circling above to rake the ridges with cannon fire. Air power had gone silent and they were alone. Chief Harmon, the team leader, dragged the informant closer and shouted above the gunfire, his words clipped and hard. "We move south bounding, 2 and 2. Keep low." The men knew better than to argue. They began shifting, leapfrogging across the rocky slope, one pair laying down cover fire while the other scrambled forward, dragging the civilian between them. The night tore apart with the rattle of PKMs, the slam of rifles, the sharp snap of rounds slicing too close. A young operator named Davis felt a round bite through his shoulder plate and spun him half around, pain flooding his body, but he clenched his teeth and pushed on, refusing to become dead weight. The ambush tightened. More shadows appeared on the ridgeline, shouting in a language that carried fury and triumph in equal measure. Harmon keyed his radio again, desperate, screaming into the mic, "Hammer, this is Viper 2-1. We are in contact, heavy fire from east and north ridges, requesting immediate close air support, danger close." Static answered him, mocking in its emptiness. The men exchanged brief glances in the chaos, each one reading the same thought in the other's eyes. They had been cut off. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. Explosions blossomed around them as RPGs slammed into the slope, sending shards of rock slicing through the air. The informant wailed in panic, but the SEAL carrying him barked in his face, "Shut up, stay low, or you're dead." They reached a depression in the earth, a shallow wash that gave them a few seconds of breathing space. Hearts hammered. Hands shook as magazines were slapped into rifles, as tourniquets were cinched on wounds. They knew this was only a pause, not safety. Harmon looked up at the sky, at the black expanse where he had been promised the thunder of jets, the roar of freedom and survival, and felt betrayal gnaw at him. Somewhere out there, the sky was full of machines built to keep men like him alive, but tonight, for reasons beyond his understanding, that sky had gone mute. His jaw clenched as he whispered to himself, "We're not dying here. Not tonight." The enemy began to advance, confident, their figures darting down the ridges in 2s and 3s, firing wildly to pin the SEALs in place. The Americans answered with precision, every shot meant to buy seconds, not to win. Ammunition dwindled. The wash filled with smoke and dust, choking the lungs, stinging the eyes. The informant clung to the dirt as though it could swallow him whole. Then, just as the SEALs began bracing for the final push of the enemy, a sound broke through the madness. It started as a faint growl, a vibration felt in the chest more than heard, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. Every man in the wash froze, heads turning upward. The growl became a roar, sharp and slicing, a jet tearing through the night at a speed that rattled bones. An F-16 had broken formation. Harmon's radio crackled, alive at last. A voice, calm but edged with strain, filled his headset. "Viper 2-1, this is Falcon. I've got you, eyes on your position. Mark your target for me." Relief flooded the SEALs like a drug. They scrambled, one man firing a flare that hissed red against the dark. The jet thundered overhead, a shadow with wings, banking hard, rolling onto its side to see the battlefield below. The insurgents hesitated, their fire faltering as the sky itself seemed to turn against them. Falcon's voice came again, steady and sure, "Danger close acknowledged. Hold tight." And then the valley erupted. The F-16 came down in a screaming dive, its engines howling like the wrath of something beyond mortal. Bright streaks tore from beneath its wings, slamming into the ridges with bone-rattling violence. Fire and rock cascaded into the night, the insurgents' shouts turning to screams. The jet pulled up at the last instant, streaking into the black, leaving behind chaos and death in its wake. The SEALs roared with it, adrenaline blasting through their exhaustion. The ambush had been broken, the silence of air power shattered by one pilot who refused to leave them behind. For the first time that night, survival seemed more than a distant hope. Harmon's voice shook with both fury and gratitude as he shouted into the mic, "Falcon, you're a goddamn angel. Stay with us." The reply came with quiet steel. "Copy that, Viper. I'm not going anywhere." The jet's thunder faded only briefly before returning, circling high above like a predator that refused to abandon its prey. The SEALs used the precious seconds bought by the first strike to reposition, dragging the informant farther down the wash toward thicker cover. Their boots slipped in gravel, lungs heaving, ears ringing from the concussive blast that had just shattered the ridges. Enemy fire sputtered, then rose again as pockets of fighters regrouped, determined to press the attack. Harmon shoved Davis, his wounded man, forward with one hand, his other gripping his rifle. "Keep moving, damn it, don't stop," he barked, his own voice raw from screaming into the chaos. Davis gritted his teeth, blood still soaking through his shoulder bandage, but he obeyed, the instinct to push forward deeper than the agony twisting his muscles. Above, the F-16 dove again, guns chattering, a stream of light cutting through the night sky. The ground shook as rounds tore into enemy positions, sending men scattering like insects beneath a floodlight. Harmon felt something like hope ignite in his chest, fragile and hot. The radio crackled with Falcon's voice, calm and clipped. "Viper 2-1, I've got 30 seconds on station before I bingo fuel. You need to move while I make another pass." The word struck Harmon like a punch. 30 seconds. One fighter, already running low, had broken formation to cover them. They couldn't waste it. He grabbed the nearest operator, O'Reilly, and pointed toward the southern ridge where their extraction awaited beyond. "We move now. On me." Without waiting, he surged forward, rifle barking at the muzzle flashes that tried to cut him down. The rest followed, dragging the informant, covering each other with deadly precision. The wash narrowed into a path littered with jagged boulders, forcing them into single file, each man a shield for the one behind. Above, Falcon screamed down again, unleashing a storm of ordnance that blasted the far ridge apart. The shockwave rattled their bones and hurled dust into their faces, but it also forced the enemy back, leaving the team a fleeting corridor of survival. They sprinted, bodies screaming in protest, weapons hot in their hands. Davis stumbled, his legs buckling, but O'Reilly caught him under the arm, dragging him onward with sheer force of will. Bullets cracked against the rocks, one grazing Harmon's helmet and sending sparks into his vision. He didn't slow. Every step carried the weight of lives depending on him, not just his men but the terrified informant whose knowledge had already saved countless others. 500 meters to the extraction point, his navigator rasped between breaths, checking his GPS through the dust. Harmon nodded, shoving the words into the radio. "Falcon, we're moving south, need one more strike, danger close, mark on the ridge line." The answer came without hesitation, steel wrapped in calm. "Copy that. Mark your position. This is the last one." O'Reilly ripped another flare from his pack, sending it streaking red into the night. The jet appeared a heartbeat later, diving at an angle so steep it seemed to defy physics, its afterburner a comet tearing the darkness. Missiles streaked out, finding the clusters of enemy fighters on the ridges, detonating in a cascade of fire and thunder that lit the valley like a false sunrise. The air grew thick with smoke and burning dust, choking but life-saving. The SEALs barreled through it, coughing, eyes streaming but refusing to stop. The informant tripped, slamming face-first into the rocks, his cries lost in the roar above, but two men yanked him back to his feet and shoved him forward, their strength dragging him toward salvation. The radio hissed again, Falcon's voice rough now, threaded with the urgency of his own dwindling fuel. "Viper 2-1, I'm Winchester and low on gas. I've got to RTB. You're on your own from here." The words hit like ice water, but Harmon forced his voice steady. "Falcon, you kept us alive. We'll make it. Get home safe." A pause, then the pilot's voice softened, stripped of all the radio formality. "Good hunting, boys. See you on the other side." Then the sky went quiet, the sound of the jet fading into the horizon, leaving only the ragged breath of men and the chaos of enemies regrouping behind them. The SEALs pressed on, weaving through the rocks, every shadow a threat. Gunfire erupted again from the high ground as the surviving insurgents realized their advantage had not vanished with the jet. tracers streaked down, carving the dark with deadly precision. The team dropped, firing back, sparks erupting from their muzzles, the air alive with lead. Harmon crawled to a vantage point, sighting down his scope, squeezing off shots that dropped figures on the ridge one after another. But for every enemy that fell, two more seemed to rise from the night. They had to keep moving or the numbers would crush them. 200 meters, the navigator shouted, his voice cracking. We're almost there. The extraction point lay just beyond a series of rock shelves, a narrow canyon where their bird was supposed to touch down. Whether the bird would be there, whether calm silence had killed that hope too, none of them knew. But it was the only chance. The team surged forward, climbing the shelves, hauling each other up by straps and arms, bullets snapping inches from their heads. Davis collapsed again at the base of the last shelf, his strength finally spent. "Leave me," he gasped, blood soaking through his gear. Harmon dropped beside him, eyes blazing. "Not a chance. You stand or you die here. And I'm not letting either happen." With O'Reilly's help, he heaved Davis onto his feet, half carrying him up the rock. At the top, the canyon yawned before them, narrow walls funneling into a flat stretch of earth barely wide enough for a helicopter. Empty. No rotors, no silhouette of salvation waiting. Just silence and darkness. The team froze, heart sinking. The informant moaned, his voice thin with despair. "They're not coming, we are finished." Harmon ignored him, scanning the sky, forcing his breathing steady despite the panic gnawing at his insides. Then, faint but growing, the distant thump of rotor blades reached them, a sound so beautiful it felt like music. The seals erupted in ragged shouts, waving arms, signaling into the night as the sound swelled into a roar. From the darkness, a black hawk surged into view, its searchlight stabbing down, illuminating the battered team with a beam of white fire. Gunfire intensified as the insurgents realized what was happening, pouring rounds into the canyon, determined to cut the Americans down before escape. The Black Hawk flared, side gunners opening up, streams of tracer fire slicing across the ridges, cutting swathes through the enemy ranks. Dust and wind blasted the seals as the bird settled, rotors hammering the air. Harmon shoved the informant forward, bellowing, "Get him in first. Go, go." The man stumbled toward the ramp, hands clawing for salvation as rounds cracked around him. Seals followed in a sprint, each one throwing themselves into the belly of the machine as gunners poured fire into the night. Davis collapsed halfway, but Harmon and O'Reilly dragged him the last meters, flinging him aboard as if hurling a sack of gold. As the last man cleared the ramp, Harmon turned, eyes burning with rage and defiance. The canyon was alive with muzzle flashes, the enemy charging through smoke and dust, desperate to drag them back down. Harmon raised his rifle, firing until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber, until the ramp master hauled him inside and slapped the signal to lift off. The Black Hawk roared upward, the earth dropping away, tracer fire reaching futilely toward it. The team lay in a heap on the floor, bloody, broken, gasping but alive. Harmon pressed his head back against the cold metal, the image of Falcon's jet burning through his mind. One pilot who had chosen to break orders, to risk fuel and wrath, because he refused to let them die in silence. Harmon whispered under his breath, a vow and a prayer in one. "We'll never forget you, Falcon. Never." The Black Hawk clawed upward into the night, rotors hammering the thin air, engines straining under the weight of men and the burden of survival. Inside, the SEALs lay sprawled across the floor, battered and bloody, their chests heaving like men dragged from drowning. The smell of cordite and burned dust clung to their gear, mixing with the metallic tang of blood that soaked into their uniforms. The informant sat huddled in a corner, wide-eyed and shaking, clutching his knees as though he could fold himself small enough to disappear from the nightmare that still howled below. Harmon forced himself onto his knees, ignoring the burning ache in his ribs where shrapnel had carved a shallow groove. He looked over his men, checking faces in the dim red cabin light. Davis was pale, slumped against the wall with O'Reilly pressing a hand over his wound to slow the bleeding. The others bore cuts, burns, and exhaustion etched into every line of their bodies, but they were alive, and in this world that meant everything. The crew chief leaned forward, shouting above the roar of the engines. "We're taking heavy fire from the ridges. Hold on." As if on cue, the bird shuddered, rounds pinging off its armored belly, tracers streaking past the open doors where gunners unleashed furious streams into the night. The Black Hawk banked hard, pressing the SEALs against the floor, the world outside tilting into chaos. Harmon grabbed a strap, bracing himself, his eyes locked on the ramp as flashes of enemy fire arced up toward them like reaching claws. Every second felt borrowed, every heartbeat a coin tossed between survival and death. And then once again the sky roared. The sound was different now, deeper, angrier, a familiar growl that made Harmon's chest tighten with disbelief. He looked up through the open door, and there it was, slicing through the darkness like vengeance made metal. Falcon's F-16, banking hard, afterburner lighting the night in a streak of fire. The pilot had come back. The SEALs erupted into shouts that blended relief with awe, their voices ragged but alive. The jet screamed past the Black Hawk, rolling onto its side, releasing a pair of bombs that thundered into the ridges where the enemy had gathered, silencing their guns beneath avalanches of rock and fire. The ground bloomed with explosions, shaking even the Black Hawk in its climb. Harmon's radio crackled, Falcon's voice rough, strained, but unbroken. Viper 2-1, Falcon back on station. Couldn't leave you hanging. Harmon's throat tightened, words catching. He pressed the transmit key, his voice low but fierce. Falcon, you were supposed to be out of fuel. How the hell? The pilot cut him off with a wry chuckle that masked exhaustion. I found a tanker willing to bend rules. Had to sweet-talk him midair, but I topped off just enough. Figured you'd still need me. The SEALs looked at each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. A man who should have already been halfway home had gambled everything to return, to watch over them as they clawed their way from death's grip. The Black Hawk surged south, guided by the glow of distant flares marking the safe zone. Falcon stayed with them, circling above, unleashing bursts of cannon fire at pursuing vehicles that had begun racing across the valley floor. Each pass from the jet carved destruction into the night, buying the helicopter space to escape. Harmon watched through the open door as fire blossomed behind them, enemy trucks turned into burning husks by precision strikes. He knew without Falcon, those vehicles would have cut them off, boxed them in, slaughtered them before the bird ever reached altitude. Minutes stretched like hours. The helicopter finally cleared the mountains, rotors thumping steady now, the air smoother as they left the killing ground behind. The gunners relaxed their grips, scanning the darkness with weary vigilance but finding no more muzzle flashes chasing them. The Black Hawk climbed higher, the horizon opening, the promise of safety finally drawing near. Inside, Harmon sank against the wall, head bowed, his entire body shaking with the adrenaline crash. He looked across at Davis, whose lips were pale, eyes half-lidded, but still alive. O'Reilly caught Harmon's gaze and gave a tired nod. They had all seen enough death to know how rare this was, to be torn to pieces and still come out breathing. Falcon's voice came again, softer now, almost personal. Viper 2-1, looks like you're in the clear. I'll stay overhead until your feet dry. Harmon keyed the radio, his voice hoarse. Falcon, you've already done more than any man could ask. We owe you everything. Silence lingered, then the pilot replied, his words carrying the weight of fatigue and something deeper. Just doing my job, brother. But I'll tell you this, watching you fight down there, watching you refuse to quit, reminded me why I climb into this cockpit every damn day. You boys keep fighting like that and I'll keep showing up. The Black Hawk dipped low as lights appeared on the horizon, the glow of a forward operating base flickering in the night. Soldiers on the ground scrambled as the helicopter descended, medics rushing forward with stretchers as the bird flared and touched down in a blast of dust. The SEALs staggered off, half carried, half crawling, every step heavy with exhaustion. The informant was whisked away by intelligence officers, his survival secured, his knowledge still alive because one pilot refused to let the world go silent. Harmon stayed behind, helping Davis onto a stretcher, refusing to leave until all his men were accounted for. Only then did he lift his eyes to the sky where the faint roar of the F-16 echoed, a lone guardian circling above. He raised the radio one last time. Falcon, this is Viper 2-1. We're on the ground, all accounted for. Mission success. You saved us tonight. You ever find yourself at our fire pit, beers are on us. The pilot laughed softly, a tired sound. I'll hold you to that. Safe home, Viper. Then the frequency went dead, and the jet banked toward the horizon, its afterburner a final streak of fire against the stars before vanishing into the night. On the ground, Harmon and his men collapsed into the dirt, the weight of survival pressing them flat. Medics worked frantically, lights flashing, voices shouting, but for the SEALs, it all blurred into background noise. What cut through was the memory of the valley, of the silence that had nearly swallowed them, and the roar that had broken it. Falcon was gone now, returning to whatever base would reprimand him for breaking formation, for disobeying the rigid lines of command, but in the hearts of the men he saved, he was no longer just a pilot. He was a brother, etched forever into their story, into the night when air power had gone silent, until one man refused to let it stay that way. The forward operating base buzzed with controlled chaos as the Black Hawk's rotors spun down, the dust settling into a thick haze that coated everything in grit. Medics swarmed the helicopter, pulling Davis onto a stretcher and rushing him toward the medical tent, for lines already dangling, voices sharp with urgency. Other operators staggered under their own weight, some collapsing onto crates and sandbags, hands trembling as the adrenaline drained from their veins. The informant had already been whisked away into the shadows of the intelligence compound, his survival a small miracle that would ripple through briefing rooms and strategy tables far from this place. But for the SEALs, the war was stripped of strategy. It was blood, exhaustion, and the pounding echo of survival. Harmon stood in the middle of it, his helmet tucked under his arm, dust clinging to the sweat running down his face. He stared toward the horizon, where the faint roar of the departing F-16 had vanished minutes before, leaving only silence. His chest felt hollow, carved by gratitude too deep for words. Later, after wounds had been bound and blood scrubbed from their gear, the SEALs gathered in the dim confines of their barracks. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and sweat, the hum of generators pressing into the silence. O'Reilly sat cross-legged on a bunk, his hands still trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette, the ember glowing like a lighthouse in the gloom. "I thought we were done," he muttered, his voice low but heavy with truth. "Not just done, erased. No one would have even known how we went down." Davis lay on the cot beside him, pale but alive, his shoulder wrapped in clean bandages. He forced a grin, weak but stubborn. "Then that Falcon bastard shows up, and suddenly we've got the wrath of God raining down on those ridges." The others chuckled, weary but genuine, the sound cutting through the heaviness like a knife. Harmon remained quiet, seated at the edge of his bunk, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if replaying every second of the valley in his head. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of command. "He broke orders for us. You all know that. If he stayed with his formation, we'd be gone right now. They'll burn him for it." The team fell silent, the laughter fading into unease. They knew Harmon was right. Pilots lived under strict doctrine, their every move scrutinized, their disobedience punished no matter the result. Falcon had made a choice, his men or his orders, and though the SEALs knew which side of that choice had saved them, the brass would see it differently. O'Reilly exhaled smoke, shaking his head. "Man saves a whole team and they're gonna hang him out to dry? That's some bullshit." Harmon's jaw tightened, his voice quiet but sharp. "That's the system. But systems don't bleed in the dirt. Men do. And men like him keep us alive." Morning came with the smell of burnt coffee and the thud of helicopters cycling missions. Harmon was summoned to the command tent, a large structure of canvas and steel where maps glowed under harsh lamps and officers spoke in clipped tones over radios. A colonel stood at the head of the table, his uniform crisp despite the dust. He motioned Harmon forward. "Your team brought the asset out alive. Against all odds you did the job. For that, command is grateful." Harmon saluted, his face a mask of discipline, but the colonel's next words hit harder. "I've also been informed one of our pilots broke formation last night. He was off station for nearly an hour, running strikes without authorization. You were his priority. I need to know exactly what happened." Harmon's throat tightened, but he answered evenly. "Sir, what happened is simple. We were ambushed, cut off, outnumbered. Our air cover never arrived. Falcon did. Without him we'd be body bags right now. He disobeyed orders, yes, but he saved American lives." The colonel studied him, face unreadable. "That may be. But disobedience sets precedent and precedent weakens command. That's the reality." Harmon's fists clenched behind his back, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to shout, to rage that precedent didn't matter when men bled in valleys, that lives should weigh more than doctrine. But discipline locked his jaw and he remained silent. The colonel dismissed him with a nod, already turning back to his maps. As Harmon walked out into the sun, he felt the heat of anger simmering in his chest. Falcon had risked everything for them, and now the machine of command was grinding forward, ready to crush him under regulations that had never stared down an ambush in the dark. That evening, the SEALs gathered again, their talk low, voices edged with frustration. Davis, propped up on his cot, spat his anger into the air. "He's gonna take the fall, isn't he? While we sit here breathing because of him." Harmon nodded, his eyes hard. "They'll write him up. Maybe worse. Ground him. Career's over, all because he chose us over orders." The room filled with heavy silence until O'Reilly spoke, his tone defiant. "Then we don't let that happen. We put it on record, every man here. He saved us. They can't bury that." Harmon looked around at his men, each one battered but resolute. For a long moment he said nothing, then finally nodded. Fine. We write it, we sign it, every one of us. If he burns, it won't be in silence. 2 days later, the SEALs were flown back to Bugram for debrief. They entered a sterile room, its walls lined with maps and screens, a long table where officers waited with pens poised. Questions came rapid fire. Positions, enemy numbers, weapon counts, the informant's condition. The SEALs answered with precision, recounting every detail of the mission. Then came the question Harmon had expected. At what point did Falcon engage without authorization? Harmon leaned forward, his voice steady, his eyes unblinking. At the point where we were seconds from being overrun. At the point where his choice was our survival or our deaths. He made the right call. His men echoed him, one after another, their statements clear and unwavering. The officers scribbled notes, their faces tight with disapproval, but the words were on record now, carved into the official story. Falcon had saved them. That night, after the debriefing, Harmon stood on the airstrip, watching jets thunder off into the darkness. Among them was Falcon's F-16, its silhouette vanishing into the black sky. He wondered if the pilot knew yet what storm was brewing in the halls of command, if he sat in his cockpit with the same calm steel in his voice while superiors sharpened their knives behind desks. The SEAL clenched his fists, a vow forming in his chest. They won't erase you, he whispered into the wind. Not while we breathe. The desert night was a strange paradox of silence and chaos, for while the sand dunes stretched endlessly under a moonlit sky that seemed far too peaceful for war, the SEALs were crawling through hell itself, pinned down by enemy fire from the ridgeline above. Sergeant Blake's throat was dry from sand and fear, but he refused to let it control him, because the men to his left and right looked to him for direction even as tracer rounds whipped overhead like fiery needles. The radio had gone silent for hours, their last desperate calls for close air support disappearing into static, and every man in the team had started to accept that maybe this was where their luck ended, their mission buried in blood and shifting sand. Yet something deep inside Blake refused to yield, and though his legs trembled from exhaustion, he dragged himself behind a jagged rock and scanned the horizon, hoping for anything, any sound, any movement that could mean air power had not abandoned them. The enemy fighters on the ridge knew they had the SEALs trapped and grew bolder by the minute, their muzzle flashes taunting in the darkness, forcing the Americans lower and lower into the dust. Corporal Diaz muttered curses under his breath as he slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle, his hands shaking not from fear but from the adrenaline that surged through him in violent waves. "We're running dry, Sarge," he growled, ducking as bullets sprayed rock fragments into his face. "If we don't get birds on station, we're screwed." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a single sound cut across the chaos, faint at first but growing, the high-pitched scream of a jet engine ripping through the night. For a split second, every man froze, their ears straining, not daring to believe what they heard. Then it came again, louder, sharper, and this time unmistakable, the cry of an F-16 fighting Falcon slicing the sky. The SEALs lifted their heads as one, hearts leaping with wild, unfiltered hope, and though they could not yet see it, they knew what it meant. Air power was back. The enemy must have heard it too because their firing slowed, the confidence in their barrage faltering as shadows shifted on the ridgeline, men ducking into cover, suddenly uncertain. Blake grabbed the radio, voice raw with desperation. "Falcon, this is Viper team, we are danger close, I repeat, danger close. Ridge at 12 o'clock, multiple hostiles with heavy fire. We're running black on ammo. We need you now." The radio crackled, and for the first time in hours, a clear voice answered, calm and confident. "Copy that, Viper team. Hold tight. Breaking formation now. Eyes on your ridge." Those words hit like a surge of electricity through the SEALs, because they knew what it meant. A pilot was leaving his assigned formation, risking his own mission and safety to save them. Moments later, the F-16 tore across the valley, a silver blur under the moonlight, and then the ground shook as flares streaked downward, followed by the ripping thunder of cannon fire. The ridgeline exploded in a storm of dust and fire, enemy silhouettes scattering like ants under a hammer. Blake felt the shockwave in his chest and shouted at his men, "Move! Shift left while he's got them pinned." They scrambled across the sand, ducking low, hearts pounding, every step bought by the Falcon's guns above. Corporal Diaz stumbled but was yanked up by another SEAL, their bond forged by survival as much as duty. Again the jet screamed overhead, this time unleashing a pair of smart bombs that tore into the ridge with precision, fireballs lighting up the night like a new dawn. Enemy fire ceased almost instantly, their confidence shattered, their positions obliterated. The SEALs collapsed into the shadows of a deeper ravine, gasping, bleeding, alive. Blake slammed against the sand, chest heaving, listening to the ringing silence that followed destruction, broken only by the faint echo of retreating footsteps. Then the voice returned in his earpiece, steady, unshaken. "Viper team, ridge is clear for now. You're safe. I'll stay overhead until you reach exfil. You boys aren't dying out here tonight." For the first time since the mission went sideways, Blake allowed himself a small, grim smile. He looked at his team, their faces smeared with dirt and blood but lit with the fierce glow of survival, and he knew this night would be burned into their memories forever, not just for the fight, not just for the fear, but for the moment air power came alive again because one F-16 pilot refused to let them die in silence. The silence after the last explosion was almost unreal, a heavy blanket draped across the desert that made every shallow breath of the SEALs feel louder than gunfire. Sergeant Blake pressed his cheek into the hot sand for a moment, grounding himself, but he knew they couldn't stay there. The mission had already gone off the rails, but their objective was still incomplete, and they had only minutes to reach the exfil point before enemy reinforcements arrived. He dragged himself upright, scanning his men, Diaz bleeding from a graze on his arm, Harper limping with a twisted ankle, but all still alive, all still ready to move. Overhead, the F-16 circled like a guardian angel, its afterburner streaks briefly igniting the night as the pilot pulled a sharp turn. The radio buzzed in Blake's ear. "Viper team, this is Falcon 2-1. I've got eyes on your trail. You have hostiles regrouping 3 clicks east, moving fast. Recommend you shift west through that ravine before they box you in." Blake raised his head, saw the path and barked orders. "Move west, stay low, stay tight. Let's go." The team scrambled, bodies moving in practiced sync despite exhaustion. The sand sucked at their boots, the terrain uneven and treacherous, but none dared slow down. Behind them, the sound of engines grew, a convoy of enemy trucks closing in, headlights cutting across the dunes like hunting spears. The SEALs dropped into the ravine just as Falcon 2-1 screamed overhead again, unleashing a cascade of flares that lit up the convoy. Then the roar of the Vulcan cannon shredded the night, the ground trembling as rounds tore through metal. Explosions erupted as 2 trucks burst into fireballs, the enemy formation scattering into chaos. The men in the ravine shielded their faces from the rain of debris, hearts hammering with the surreal knowledge that without that single jet, they'd already be dead. They pushed on, deeper into the darkness, but it was clear the pilot wasn't just giving them cover, he was risking everything. Blake knew breaking formation wasn't a small decision. Somewhere up there, Falcon 2-1 had an original mission, a commander expecting him to stay with the flight, and yet he'd chosen to break away. The SEALs didn't know his name, didn't know his face, but at that moment he was closer to them than any brother. Harper stumbled, his ankle giving way, and Diaz slung his arm around his shoulder, dragging him forward with raw determination. "Come on man, we're not dying here," Diaz growled. They could hear shouts echoing across the dunes, enemy soldiers regrouping, and then the sharp bark of gunfire as bullets ricocheted off rocks near the ravine. Blake dropped to one knee, returned fire, buying his men precious seconds. "Falcon, they're on us again," he yelled into the radio. The reply came instantly, steady as steel. "Copy. Mark your position with IR strobe. I'll keep them off you." Blake ripped the small device from his pack, snapped it on and shoved it against the rocks. Within seconds, the jets screamed overhead, unseen but felt in every bone, and then the ridge above them erupted as bombs detonated with surgical precision. The shockwave almost threw them off their feet, but when the dust cleared, the enemy gunfire was gone. "You're clear for now," the pilot said calmly. "Keep moving. I'll ride shotgun all the way." The SEALs didn't waste a second. They trudged forward, lungs burning, hearts pounding. Every man knew they were still in the kill zone, still deep in hostile territory, and every step was a gamble. Yet for the first time since the ambush, there was hope, because above them was proof they weren't forgotten. Minutes stretched like hours as they pushed deeper into the ravine. The exfil point was still a mile away, but the terrain grew steeper, forcing them to climb jagged rocks while staying low under cover of darkness. Harper gritted his teeth with every step, pain radiating from his ankle, but he refused to be carried, refused to be the reason they slowed. Blake climbed beside him, steadying him without a word, while Diaz and Miller kept their rifles trained behind, ready for the next shadow to appear. Overhead, Falcon 2-1 dipped low again, a thunderous guardian slicing the night. But this time the radio carried a new edge. "Viper team, I've got multiple bandits inbound. Fast movers. They're tracking me. You need to reach exfil in 10 minutes or less, because I might not be able to stay much longer." The words hit like a hammer. The SEALs exchanged glances in the dark, the unspoken fear obvious. The pilot had bought them time, but now he was the target, enemy jets closing in to hunt him down. And still he stayed, circling above them, refusing to leave them stranded. Blake clenched his fists, rage and respect burning together. "We'll make it," he swore, more to himself than anyone else. He forced his men faster, every muscle screaming, sweat freezing against the night air. The sound of distant engines grew louder, hostile aircraft sweeping into the sector, and for the first time, they saw Falcon 2-1 flash across the moonlight, pursued by streaks of anti-air fire from the ground. The SEALs could do nothing but run, their breaths ragged, their hearts breaking as they realized the man who had saved them was now walking the knife's edge himself. The radio hissed again. "Viper team, almost there. Don't stop. If I don't make it, you make damn sure you tell command I stayed with you." Blake almost shouted back, but the words caught in his throat because there was nothing to say. He knew the pilot had already made his choice, and it was the kind of choice soldiers carried to their graves or to their legends. The Exfil Ridge loomed ahead, and with it, the faint blinking light of the extraction helos beacon. Hope flared like fire in their chests, but so did terror because between them and salvation lay open sand, fully exposed with no cover. Blake raised his hand, halting the men, eyes scanning the horizon. "Falcon, we're exposed here. Can you cover us one last time?" The radio crackled, then came the calm reply, tinged with steel and sacrifice. "Always. Run." The order to run hit the SEALs like a surge of electricity, and before they could second-guess, their legs were pumping, boots slamming against the sand as they burst from the ravine into the open killing field. Every man knew the gamble. There was no cover, nothing but moonlit desert between them and the extraction beacon half a mile away, but hesitation meant death. Their lungs burned, their gear clattered, their shadows stretched long across the dunes, and still they pushed forward, driven not just by survival but by the voice in their ears that had refused to abandon them. Overhead, Falcon 2-1 dove like a predator, streaking past so low they could almost feel the jet wash ripple across their backs. Then came the roar of his cannon, the ground around them erupting as enemy forces on the flanks tried to cut them down, only to be shredded in a storm of fire. The SEALs didn't look back, they couldn't afford to, but they heard the explosions, felt the tremors, and knew the pilot was laying his own life on the line to shield their desperate sprint. Blake's chest felt like it would explode, every breath razor-sharp, but he forced his legs harder, eyes locked on the faint pulsing light of the Exfil helicopter beacon. Diaz was just ahead, hauling Harper by the arm, the wounded man refusing to quit despite the pain that twisted his face with every step. Behind them, Miller and Jackson fired controlled bursts at dark shapes emerging from the dunes, the sound of rifles punctuating the thunder overhead. Then the radio crackled and Falcon's voice came again, no longer calm but sharp, strained. "Viper team, bandits on me, 2 o'clock high, fast movers closing fast. I'll buy you what I can." Blake risked a glance skyward and saw it, 2 enemy jets cutting across the night, their afterburners glowing red as they locked onto Falcon 2-1. A knot twisted in Blake's gut. The pilot was outnumbered and he knew it. Yet there he was, pulling into the sky, flares spilling behind him like falling stars as he tried to break their lock. The SEALs had no time to mourn, no time to scream. All they could do was run faster, each step a prayer that the man above could hold on long enough. The Exfil helo came into view, its rotors thumping, the dark shape hovering just beyond the ridge, crewmen waving frantically for the SEALs to push through. But between them and salvation, enemy fighters had crested the dunes, rifles blazing, forcing the team to dive and return fire even as their legs screamed for rest. Tracers whipped past, sand erupted in sprays, and Harper nearly went down before Diaz yanked him forward with brute strength, screaming, "Come on, brother. We're almost there." Overhead, Falcon 2-1 pulled a desperate maneuver, rolling hard and cutting across the moonlight with a snap turn that sent one pursuing jet wide. His cannon thundered, sparks erupting on the enemy's fuselage, but the second jet was still locked, missiles streaking into the night. The SEALs hit the ridge just as the first missile detonated near Falcon's tail, a blinding flash tearing through the sky. Blake's heart seized. Had they lost him? But then, impossibly, the F-16 burst through the fireball, smoke trailing, still fighting, still there. The pilot's voice came again, ragged but unbroken. "Viper team, move your asses. You're clear to board." That was all they needed. With one last collective roar, the SEALs surged forward, bullets snapping at their heels, and crashed into the perimeter of the waiting helo. Crewmen yanked them aboard, hands grabbing, dragging, hauling as the team collapsed into the cabin, gasping, bleeding, alive. But it wasn't over, not yet. As the helicopter lifted, enemy fire peppered the hull, forcing the door gunners to unleash a stream of tracers back into the desert. The SEALs barely had time to strap in when Blake crawled to the open side, eyes locked on the sky. Falcon 2-1 was still up there, weaving between streaks of missile fire, his jet bleeding smoke, his odds shrinking by the second. Yet he hadn't left. He circled over the helo like a wounded hawk, still shielding them, still keeping the hunters at bay. Blake slammed a fist against the steel wall, torn between fury and awe. "Come on, Falcon," he muttered, voice breaking. "Get out of here." The radio crackled once more, the pilot's voice steady despite everything. "Viper team, you're clear. Bird is out of the hot zone. Mission success. Don't you worry about me, I'll handle these guys." And then, before anyone could reply, Falcon 2-1 pulled into a vertical climb, his F-16 screaming against the night as he dragged both enemy jets upward, away from the retreating helicopter. The SEALs watched in stunned silence, every man pressed against the windows, eyes locked on the tiny shapes tearing into the stars. They saw the missiles streak, saw the flashes explode in the sky, saw the dance of fire and metal as one man chose to carry the fight away from them and into the heavens. Harper, clutching his ankle, whispered hoarsely, "He stayed with us till the end." Blake's throat closed, his vision blurring with rage, gratitude, and grief all mixed together. He wanted to scream at the pilot to break off to save himself, but deep down he knew, this was the choice the man had made, and some choices burned themselves into history, into the hearts of those who lived because of them. The helicopter banked hard, fleeing the kill zone, but even as the desert stretched away beneath them, the team could still hear it, the thunder of a single F-16, broken, smoking, refusing to fall, carrying the weight of their survival on wings that should have already been torn apart. In that moment, none of the SEALs thought of their mission, their orders, or the medals that might come. They thought only of the nameless voice in their ears, the man who had defied silence, broken formation, and given everything so they could live. The helicopter carved its way across the night sky, blades hammering the silence as the desert shrank behind them, but inside the cabin there was no sense of relief, no celebration, only a heavy silence broken by ragged breaths and the rattling of loose gear. Every man sat pressed against the metal walls, weapons limp in their hands, eyes locked on the windows as though they could still see the battle above. Sergeant Blake sat near the open side door, wind slapping at his face, his heart caught between gratitude for survival and dread for what he feared was happening in the skies behind. The radio still crackled in his ear, faint static, carrying whispers of a fight far greater than anything they could touch. Falcon 2-1 was still up there, his single F-16 bleeding smoke, chased by enemy fighters like wolves circling a wounded stag. Yet his voice had been steady, his will unbroken, and that haunted Blake more than the fireballs in the distance. Every second felt like a knife twisting in the SEALs' chests, because though they were safe, their rescuer was not. Diaz leaned forward, staring at the floor, his fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. "He could have left us," he muttered, voice rough with disbelief. "Nobody would have blamed him. But he stayed. He broke formation just to drag us out." Harper, pale and trembling, lifted his head. "He didn't just stay," he whispered. "He fought for us like we were his own." The cabin fell silent again, the truth of those words too heavy for argument. Blake's eyes stayed on the sky, searching for a flare, an explosion, anything that would tell him Falcon's fate, but the night kept its secrets, swallowing the battle whole. Minutes stretched endlessly, and the helicopter finally banked north, toward friendly territory, the beacon of the forward operating base flickering on the horizon. The crew chief leaned out, scanning the darkness, his face hard as stone, but even he couldn't hide the respect in his eyes when he glanced back at the SEALs. No one needed to say it, every man aboard knew they were alive because one pilot had refused to accept silence. Then, faint and almost ghostly, the radio came alive again, the voice cracking through static. "Viper team. Falcon 2-1. You clear?" Blake snatched the headset, heart slamming. "Falcon. We're clear, all aboard. You still with us?" A pause, then a strained chuckle, ragged with exhaustion but alive. "Still with you. Birds hurt bad but I shook them off for now. Heading back low. Don't tell command I broke from formation, they'll skin me alive." Relief washed over the team like a tidal wave, laughter bursting out despite their exhaustion. Not wild or loud but the shaky, desperate kind of laughter that comes when death brushes past and chooses someone else. Blake felt his throat tighten, his chest heavy with words he couldn't speak. "Falcon," he said quietly, "you saved us. Every damn one of us. We won't forget it." The pilot's reply was softer now, more human than soldier. "Just doing my job, boys. Get home safe." The radio went silent after that, but it didn't matter. They had heard him and it was enough. The helicopter touched down at the forward base just before dawn, rotors whipping up dust as medics rushed in, pulling the battered SEALs onto stretchers, patching wounds, checking vitals. Blake resisted the hands tugging at him until he staggered clear of the chaos, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, waiting for the sound of a jet engine. For a long while nothing came. The sun crept higher, painting the desert gold, and still Blake stood there, Diaz and Harper beside him, their bodies broken but their spirits tied to the sky. Then, faint at first but growing, came the roar of a jet limping across the heavens. Heads turned, soldiers squinting upward, and there it was, the scarred silhouette of an F-16, trailing smoke but flying steady, wheels dropping as it angled toward the base runway. Cheers erupted across the tarmac, men and women raising their fists as the Falcon came in hard, bouncing once, twice, before skidding to a stop with sparks spraying from its landing gear. For a moment, it seemed the jet might collapse, but then it steadied, rolling to a halt, battered but unbroken. Blake's chest swelled with something he couldn't name, pride, gratitude, awe, all twisting together into a weight he would carry forever. When the canopy hissed open, ground crews swarmed the plane, and a single figure pulled himself free, helmet tucked under his arm. The pilot was younger than Blake expected, his flight suit scorched, his face smeared with sweat and grit, but his eyes were steady, the same eyes that had spoken through the radio with calm in the midst of hell. The SEALs limped forward despite the medics' protests, and when they reached him there were no salutes, no formalities, only the raw grip of warriors who had stared at death together and lived. Diaz clasped his hand, shaking it hard. "You're the reason we're here, brother." Harper's voice cracked as he added, "Your family now." Blake said nothing at first, only looked the man in the eyes, then finally spoke. "You broke formation to save us. That's not just duty, that's honor." The pilot gave a tired smile, shaking his head. "I couldn't let you die out there alone. Not on my watch." And in that moment the bond was sealed, not by medals or ranks but by survival, by the fire of battle and the choice of one man who refused to let silence be the last word. In the days that followed, the story spread across the base, whispered in mess halls, carried through radio chatter, told and retold by soldiers who needed hope in a war that often felt endless. They spoke of the SEALs who were trapped, of the night when air power had gone silent, and of the lone Falcon that broke formation, defied orders, and came roaring back to save them. Blake knew legends were often born from pain, but this one was different. It was born from sacrifice, from loyalty, from a voice on the radio that never wavered. He and his men carried it with them long after, through every mission, every firefight, every moment when hope seemed lost. Because they knew that somewhere in the sky, someone like Falcon 2-1 might be watching, ready to break silence again. And even years later, when the desert was far behind them, when metals gathered dust and scars grew old, the memory burned bright. The night the SEALs were saved not by luck, not by chance, but by the courage of one pilot who refused to let them be forgotten. The end.